Hello, Algebra 2, Part 2. This is 821, the first day of this. We're going to be solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So this is something that's kind of tricky and has a lot of steps. So we're going to spend 2 days in it. So the whole objective of what we're doing today is to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. And the methods that we have covered so far to solve quadratic equations are to solve them by factoring and to solve by taking square roots. Okay, and what we have left to cover is to solve by completing the square and to solve by the quadratic formula. Okay, so there are a few things that we can say about all of these methods. Okay, so solving by factoring doesn't always work, because you know there are just some things that you can't factor. Okay, so we can say it doesn't always work because some things are non-factorable. Solving by taking square roots doesn't always work because when you're solving by taking square roots, it kind of has to be set up perfectly that you can have a square root that you can get by itself. So let's see, so we can say it doesn't always work because we don't always have it set up that way. Okay, and then solving by completing the square, this always works, but it's sometimes easier than others. And the quadratic formula always works, but lots of arithmetic. Okay, so factoring doesn't always work because some things are non-factorable. Solving by taking square roots doesn't always work because we don't always have it set up that way. We don't always have a square root that we can isolate. Solving by completing the square, this is what we're going to be doing today. That's today's lesson. This always works, but sometimes it's easier than others. And we're going to talk about the times that it's easier than others. That kind of depends on the equation that you have and some of the terms and the numbers that you're working with. And you'll see what I mean by the end of these next 2 lessons. You'll be able to tell when it's easier to use completing the square and when it's not to. And the quadratic formula always works, but the quadratic formula kind of has lots of arithmetic, and so if sometimes there's a lot of room for error with this if you're not simplifying your numbers completely or correctly. But it can be a nice option as long as you work through it methodically and carefully. Okay, so today, we've done these 2 so far, solving by factoring and solving by taking square roots. Today we're going to do completing the square. We'll be in this for 2 days, and then the last method is the quadratic formula, so that'll probably be later this week. So when you are solving by completing the square, what you want to watch out for are these things called perfect square trinomials. Well, actually, what we should say is when you're solving by completing the square, you are forcing something to be a perfect square trinomial. An example of perfect square trinomials, these are listed in your handout, but I'll throw a few here. We could have x squared plus 8x plus 16, and if we factor that, that would give us x plus 4 times x plus 4, or x plus 4 squared. Or we could have something like x squared minus 10x plus 25, and if we factor that, that would give us x minus 5 times x minus 5, which is x minus 5, the whole thing squared. Okay, so these are perfect square trinomials because when you factor them, if you look at their factors, they are exactly the same, right? You could factor these with first and last, and when you run through the whole first and last, you get two factors that are exactly the same, so then you could rewrite them as one set of parentheses, the whole thing squared. Okay, and so we went over these kinds of things in Chapter 5 at the beginning of the year when we were learning how to factor and FOIL. So now we're going to have equations. So you might have an equation that looks like these. You might have something like x squared minus 10x plus 25 is 0, right? You can have an equation like that that you have to solve, okay? And then you know it's a perfect square trinomial, so that would make life really easy. But then it might not always be like this. Maybe it'll be something different. And what we're going to do today is you could take any equation and force it to be a perfect square trinomial and then solve it that way. Okay? So when we're solving by completing the square, we are taking any trinomial and forcing it to be a perfect square trinomial. So let me write that down. Okay, so we can say that solving by completing the square is taking any trinomial and forcing it to be a perfect square trinomial. Right? You're forcing it to look like that, and a perfect square trinomial is some kind of, you could have x minus a number, the whole thing squared, or x plus a number, the whole thing squared. So we're forcing it to look like that and solving it. So maybe you've heard the expression forcing a square peg through a round hole, and that's kind of what we're doing here. Okay, taking something that isn't really what it is, forcing it to be something else, and making it work. So we go on to the next page of your handout. When you're completing the square, what you're going to find is you're finding your constant term or your C term. Now, where the heck am I getting this term from, the C term? Well, remember, the format of a trinomial is ax squared plus bx plus c. So that C term, this last term on the end, is what we're talking about. Okay? So that's what you're going to be finding. So from those trinomials that I threw up a few minutes ago, we had x squared plus 8x plus 16, and then x squared minus 10x plus 25. What you're going to be working with, and what you're going to be focusing on, and how you're going to be doing a lot of stuff is with those last numbers at the end. You'll be paying attention to those and doing stuff with those. Okay, so that's kind of the background information on completing the square. And so now we're going to go into the steps. Now you have the steps there on your handout, and so they're laid out for you to read. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start going through the examples, and then we'll be going through the whole process and all the steps as we go through the examples. Okay, so I'm jumping into the classwork, and so our first problem is v squared plus 6v minus 7 is 0. Okay, and so all of these we will solve by completing the square. Okay, now So your first step is to get it set equal to 0, because sometimes there's a whole lot going on. Terms could be all over the place. Things could be factored. Things could not be simplified. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to simplify and get it set equal to 0. And then what you want to do is you want to move your C term over. Okay, so my C term, this minus 7, we want to move that to the other side. So I will plus 7 plus 7. So now I have v squared plus 6v is 7. Okay? Now, if our... And then what we want to do is we want to divide each side of the equation by a. Okay? Now, remember, your a term is the number that is hiding in front of v. Okay? And we don't have anything hiding right there, or we can't see anything. So we know it must be 1. So then what we would do is we would go through and we would divide everything by 1. Okay? And for our purposes, when we divide by 1, it doesn't change anything. So this problem is going to stay exactly the same. So that's really nice. So today we're going to do all problems where your a term is all 1. So this step where you go ahead and divide by it is not going to change anything today. Tomorrow, in tomorrow's class, we'll do a lot of problems where your a term is not 1, and then that will kind of have an effect on things. But today, we don't have to worry about that. So then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate b divided by 2 squared. So where am I getting this b from? Well, your b term is the coefficient in front of your second term. So for this particular problem, it's 6. Okay? So what I'm going to be doing here is I'll take 6 divided by 2. I'm going to square that, and I'm going to simplify this step by step. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, and then I'm going to square that. Now, this 3 that I just figured out is going to be really important later, so I'm going to put a star under that. Okay, we're going to use that later. Now, if we take 3 and we square it, we get 9. Okay, and so we're going to use that 9. So, what I'm going to do, let's see, this 9 we add to both sides. And what I'll do is I'm going to go up here and do this. Okay? So we're going to add that 9 to both sides, and we're going to add it to both sides of that equation. Okay? So I'm going to have v squared plus 6v. And I'll do the 9 in a different color so you can see. So plus 9 equals 7 plus 9. Right? So what I have going on, I have my original equation, the v squared plus 6v equals 7, and then I added 9 to both sides. Okay? And where did I get that 9 from? From this b over 2, the whole thing squared. And why do I do that? Well, just because that's the way it works, and that's one of the steps of completing the square. So now what we're going to do is we're going to simplify what we have going on right here. So we've got this v squared plus 6v plus 9, and then on the other side we can do 7 plus 9, which is 16. Okay? Now, this we can factor. And this is going to factor really easily. This factors into x plus 3, the whole thing squared. Okay, I did that really fast. Now, when you're completing the square, you can factor these things really, really quickly. And there's a shortcut. There's going to be a shortcut in all of your factoring when you're completing the square. Do you remember a few minutes ago when we were doing this b over 2, the whole thing squared, we got this number 3. This 3 is the number that you use when you factor. And that's why I said, let's hold on to it. Okay? So that's how I did this so quickly. is I just pulled that number here. And it'll always work out like that. If this is a negative, then we would have a negative 3 there. Okay, so that factoring in this step is always easy. You can just take whatever number you have right here before you square it, and that goes in your parentheses. So now we have this equation that we can solve. X plus 3, the whole thing squared, is 16. So what I'm going to do is I take the square root of both sides, and I'll get x plus 3 is plus or minus 4. So now that gives me two equations that I have to solve. I have x plus 3 is a positive 4, and x plus 3 is a negative 4. Okay, and then I subtract 3, and I get x is positive 1, and I subtract 3 here, and I get x is negative 7. And those are your two answers there, and that's completing the square. Okay, so that's the first example. Let's go on into the second example. So for number 2, we have w squared minus 2w minus 16 is 0. Okay, so first step, move your c term over. So add 16, add 16. So I have w squared minus 2w is 16. And then we would divide by a. So we would divide everything by 1. Nothing changes, so that's good. So I still have w squared minus 2w is 16. Okay, so now we're going to figure out our b over 2 squared, right? So the b that we're going to use is this negative 2. So I'm going to do b over 2 squared. So that's going to be negative 2 over 2, the whole thing squared. And a negative 2 over 2, that's going to turn into negative 1, the whole thing squared. I'm going to put a star under that negative 1 because I'm going to use it later when I factor, okay? And then, so when I square that, I get a positive 1, okay? Whoops, and I could have done this in red. And then this positive 1, we're going to add to both sides. Okay? So I'll have w squared minus 2w plus 1 is 16 plus 1, right? So I took this 1 and I added it to both sides of my equation down here, right? I can underline where I did that. See, there's the plus 1, and there's the plus 1, and then w squared minus 2w is original from what we had in the previous step, and the 16 is from what we had in the previous step. And then we can go ahead and simplify this, and we get w squared minus 2w plus 1 is 17, okay? So we're going to kick this up here, and then our next step is to factor. Now remember, this is the step where the factoring is really easy, okay? So we just use the number that we got when, or right before we squared it. And so this factors really, really easily, and it turns into w minus 1, the whole thing squared, right? Just took that negative 1, that's all I did. And then it equals 17. And so now we just solve this. So I'll take the square root of both sides. Okay, so I get w minus 1 is equal to plus or minus root 17. We can't take the square root of 17. That's as nice as we can make it, so we'll leave it like that. And then we add 1 to both sides. So we get w is plus or minus root 17 plus 1. Well, I would really like to write this answer with my 1 first, so I'm going to rewrite it as w is 1 plus or minus root 17. Okay? So that's your answer there. And then this plus or minus makes it count for 2 answers. And so, you know, writing it this way is kind of the shortcut for writing 2 answers at once. But what this means is 1 plus root 17 and 1 minus root 17. Alright, so those are your 2 answers, and then we can shorten it and write them all together with the plus or minus sign. Alright, let's take a look at number 3. So for number 3, we have z squared minus 4z plus 4 is 0. Okay? So first step is we move our c term over. So I'll minus 4, so z squared minus 4z is negative 4. And then we'll divide everything by our a term, which is 1. Well, dividing everything by 1 doesn't change anything. So we still have z squared minus 4z is negative 4. Okay? And now we're going to figure out our b over 2 squared. And so my b term, in this case, is going to be negative 4. So I'll do negative 4 divided by 2, the whole thing squared. Well, negative 4 divided by 2 gives me a negative 2. Okay? And this negative 2, I'm going to put a star under it because we're going to use it later when we factor. And that's going to turn into a positive 4. And that positive 4, we're going to add to both sides. So then I'm going to have z squared minus 4z plus 4. Okay, and then on the right side, well, I take that negative 4 that I already had on the right side, and then I add the plus 4 that I just figured out. Okay, so z squared minus 4z comes from the original part of the problem. The plus 4 comes from the 4 that we had to add to both sides. The negative 4 comes from the original part of the problem, and then this plus 4 comes from what we have to add to both sides. So we can go ahead and simplify this, and we get z squared minus 4z plus 4 is going to equal 0. Okay, now let's bring this up here, and then we can factor this, and this is something we can factor very easily. We're going to use this negative 2. Right, so our factoring is just z minus 2, the whole thing squared. And then this equals what we have over here on the other side of the equal sign, which is 0. So now we can take the square root of both sides. Okay, and the square root of z minus 2 squared is just going to be z minus 2, and the square root of 0 is 0. So this is the case, because it's just 0, we don't have a plus or minus, so we're only going to get one answer. And so z is just 2. Okay, so just one answer there, but it works out nicely. Alright, let's go on to number 4. So for number 4, we have u squared plus 8u plus 16 is 0. Okay, so let's move the 16 to the other side. So I have u squared plus 8u is negative 16, and then we divide everything by our a term of 1. And remember that dividing by 1 doesn't change anything. Okay, so we still have u squared plus 8u is negative 16. And now we're going to figure out our b over 2 squared. And our b is going to be this positive 8. So I'll have 8 over 2, the whole thing squared. And 8 over 2 is 4. Right? And that 4, that 4 we're going to use when we go ahead and factor. And 4 squared is a positive 16. Okay? So this 16 that we just figured out, we're going to add to both sides. So I'll take my original piece of the problem, u squared plus 8u, and then I add the 16 that I just figured out, right? And then on the other side, well, originally I had negative 16, so I hold on to that, and then I add the positive 16 that I just figured out, okay? And so now I'll go ahead and simplify this, and I get u squared plus 8u plus 16 is 0. So now let's kick this up here. And now we're at the point where we can factor. And remember, this factoring is really easy. We just use this 4 that we figured out and put a star under. So it's going to be u plus 4, the whole thing squared. And that equals this 0 that we have on the other side of the equal sign here. So we can take the square root of both sides. And then we'll get u plus 4. There's only one type of 0, so you don't have to worry about the plus or minus. And then we subtract 4, and u is -4, and that's our solution, and we're all done. Alright, the last example, number 5. Let's see, so for number 5, we have x squared minus 6x plus 5 is 0. Okay? So first up, we take our c term and move that to the other side. So subtract 5, subtract 5. So I have x squared minus 6x is -5. Now we'll divide by our a term of 1. So divide everything by 1. And so, well, dividing by 1 doesn't change anything. So we have x squared minus 6x is -5. And now we'll figure out our b divided by 2 squared. Okay? So our b is just going to be this -6. So I'll have -6, the whole thing divided by 2 squared. Okay, well, -6 divided by 2 is -3. Let's put a star under that because we're going to use that in a little bit. And then we'll square it, and that equals 9. So that 9 we will add to both sides. Okay, so my original piece of the problem up here, x squared minus 6x, I take that down. I add the 9 to both sides. Okay. And then on the other side, well, the original piece that I had there was the -5, and then I add 9 to that. And then we can go ahead and simplify. So we're still going to have x squared minus 6x plus 9 on the left. And then on the right, well, that -5 plus 9, that'll turn into a +4. Okay? So we kick this up here. We can factor it. So x squared minus 6x plus 9, well, that'll factor really easy. We'll just use this -3 that we figured out and starred earlier. So our factor is going to be x minus 3, the whole thing squared, and it equals what we have on the other side of the equal sign down here, which is our 4. So then we can go ahead and solve this, and we'll take the square root of both sides, and we'll get x minus 3 equals plus or minus 2. Right, and then at this step, we have to set up 2 equations. So I'm going to have x minus 3 is a +2, and then x minus 3 is a -2. Okay, and then in both equations, we want to get x by itself. So plus 3, x is 5, plus 3, x is, let's see, -2 plus 3 is a +1. So your 2 solutions are 5 and +1. So that's the end of example 5. So I hope you got some, I hope those examples helped you, and you can try the homework on your own.